Welcome to Disconnected. I stumbled upon this video. Senator Paul grills Moderna CEO on myocarditis. So myocarditis is that you should Google it. It's basically like a lesions that formed where the virus has taken hold in certain muscles, and especially if the myocarditis, as far as I understand, relates specifically to when it goes into the heart muscles and it damages the heart muscles. Now, I've watched quite a few things about this from different angles, and myocarditis can be deadly because you can imagine if you have lesions in your muscles in your heart. At some point that might create some interesting problems for you, let's say. The problem is that all the research that has come out about the effects of the vaccines, inoculations rather, causing myocarditis is kind of weird, because the problem is both, well, firstly, the chances of getting myocarditis are insanely small from the vaccine, but it can happen. The problem, though, is that COVID and general flu can also cause it. So the problem I've always had about the issue, I suppose, is what is causing the lesions. Is it, or let's put it this way, somebody had COVID and somebody had the vaccine, and then they get myocarditis. Was it COVID or was it the vaccine? And I guess that's the real question here. And I've not seen one of the statistics or videos or research behind it that actually says, listen, we know when the myocarditis was formed by the vaccine and when it was as a result of having COVID or flu. So I think that's the biggest issue with this whole, because until that point you can use this as a political football, left, right and center, and kick it around, blaming either playing down the effects of the vaccine and myocarditis, or making out as if, look how terrible the vaccines is. You can do both constantly. And I think it would be rather difficult to say, well, okay, somebody gets myocarditis and at a certain age, but they had both COVID or a bad flu stunt or the vaccine. And so how do you know necessarily what gave them the myocarditis? So let's play the video, because I think they kind of approached this kind of in the middle of the road, which is probably a good thing.
Senator Rand Paul grilled the CEO of Moderna at a Senate committee hearing today about raising the price of Moderna's COVID vaccine. Let's watch some of that.
Is there a higher interest or a higher incidence of myocarditis among adolescent males 16 to 24 after taking your vaccine?
So thank you for the question, Senator. First, let me say we care deeply about safety, and we're working closely with the CDC and the FDA to
Pretty much a yes or no. Is there a higher incidence of myocarditis among boys 16 to 24 after they take your vaccine?
The data I've seen from the CDC actually shown that there's less myocarditis for people who get the vaccine versus who get COVID infection.
You're saying that for ages 16 to 24 among males who take the COVID vaccine, their risk of myocarditis is less than people who get the disease.
That is my understanding, Senator.
That is not true, and I'd like to enter into the record 6 peer-reviewed papers from the Journal of Vaccine, the Annals of Medicine, that say the complete opposite of what you say. I also spoke with your president just last week, and he readily acknowledged in private that, yes, there is an increased risk of myocarditis. The fact that you can't say it in public is quite disturbing.
See, what do you take from that? Okay, the CEO is obviously not doing himself any favors here. And the last person I would trust about telling us about the vaccine would be the CEOs of the pharmaceutical companies. There's no doubt about it. And there is enough going around that clearly states that myocarditis is something to be concerned about. And for him to just say, oh no, it's actually less, is most likely an untrue. And I don't know why he would say that. And so Senator Rand Paul obviously pulls him up for it. There are some good comments from these two guys here.
And it's interesting there, the comparison the Moderna CEO goes to of people getting the vaccine versus getting COVID. So it might be true that the risk of myocarditis from COVID is higher than the risk of myocarditis from the vaccine. But that's not really a good comparison, because so you can get COVID, because getting the vaccine is not going to prevent you from getting COVID. It's going to maybe make the symptoms of COVID not as bad, particularly if you're in a high risk category.
But that's the thing. The research shows that the worse you get COVID, the more likely it is that you get these horrible, like long COVID or a myocarditis or these kind of side effects in the long term from COVID. And although we kind of know now that the vaccines helped, they never worked 100%. So they stopped in some instances that prevented people from getting COVID, but usually not. They just made it kind of a lesser harsh flu for you. And therefore you could also argue, like it says, that it could have prevented a lot of myocarditis as well, because COVID is really bad for that.
Category or an elderly category. If you're 16, we don't actually know that it's doing all that much good for you at all. But it's not going to stop you from getting it. So you're going to face the risk of myocarditis from COVID anyway, because you're going to get it, as most people, I think, globally.
Yeah, the question is whether or not stacking it on top of each other, where it's multiple infections or
Well, the stacking, that's obviously a concern. You go, well, okay, if you now have COVID, which runs you the risk of getting myocarditis, and then you add a vaccine on top of that, which has a risk of giving you myocarditis, that you're kind of doubling the risk. But I think that from everything that I've seen and read, the risk of getting myocarditis for a healthy person from a vaccine is insanely small. And so I'm not so sure that is necessarily a problem. The one thing that I don't see in this, and I've not looked too deeply into it, but let's just
mandate 3 vaccines for adolescent boys.
The best way to burn fat and get in shape, it's not keto, paleo, fasting, or vegan, and it's not super.
This is for the public health leaders to decide. Senator.
You've been advocating for it. You've been
let's do this again.
think it's scientifically sound to mandate 3 vaccines for adolescent boys?
This is for the public health leaders to decide. Senator.
You've been advocating for it. You've been interviewed, and you've been advocating for boosters. Do you know when the myocarditis is most common among these adolescent boys? After the second dose. When I spoke with your president, he readily acknowledged in private, that maybe there ought to be a discussion whether we ought to have 1 vaccine versus 2 versus 3. If 90% of the myocarditis comes after the second dose, why don't we have a rational discussion about 1? Marty McCary, a physician from Johns Hopkins, has said exactly the same thing. It's been discussed, and yet we have this ridiculous notion from the CDC. So the CDC says, and I'll ask you this question. Let's start it as a question. Your 16-year-old's had COVID. Your 16-year-old gets better and now has recovered from COVID. You vaccinate them and they get myocarditis. Are you going to give them 2 more vaccines? Your child, give them 2 more vaccines?
I'm not a clinician. I will have to discuss.
You have children.
I think the CEO is an absolute muppet. I mean, where do we start? Number one, he doesn't answer the questions properly. He seems to be contradicting, the main Moderna dude. he's just not answering stuff properly. And he looks like completely uncomfortable being grilled like this. And then he says he's not a clinician. With all due respect, but if he's like the CEO of Moderna, he should at least have some sort of background.
I do.
Have you vaccinated your children?
I have
How many times?
3 or 4 times.
3 or 4 times.
Seems overkill, but okay. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that keeps running around in my head. So the pharmaceuticals who've developed the inoculations have made a fuck ton of money through COVID, through selling the vaccines. So for them advocating it, the question and wanting to raise the price is very suspicious, especially now that most people pretty much had COVID, and we know that COVID, having COVID and having the odd vaccine gives you a fair amount of resistance to COVID. So why are they still promoting this? Why still pushing? So I think these questions are absolutely spot on, except for the fact that they don't clearly go and say, well, haven't you made enough money off of the state, of the taxpayer? Is it really, really necessary? Is this not just, reaching for profits now, where it is not necessarily anymore? So I think that's really the crux of this. So I'd like to know what you think. Please comment down below.